Forget about your plan. He's our own. He's doing exactly what the people of Burkina Faso and many other African countries wish.
Before sunrise in the Sahel, the silence shattered. Not with a speech, not with a headline, but with impact. Within 4 days, four military bases in northern and eastern Burkina Faso were attacked in coordinated assaults. At least 10 lives were confirmed lost. Installations were damaged. Defensive positions were breached. And once again, Burkina Faso was pushed into the global spotlight, now ranked at the top of the Global Insurgency Index. But this was not just another episode in a decade-long conflict. Felt different. The real question is not simply why the attacks happened. It is why they happen now. Why 4 bases in 4 days? Why coordination instead of chaos? And why, instead of despair, are many young Africans responding with defiance? To understand this moment, we have to look deeper. This was not random, it was a signal. In insurgent warfare, randomness creates fear. Coordination creates narrative. These attacks were not isolated roadside bombs. They were synchronized strikes on symbols of state authority. When armed groups hit multiple military installations in rapid succession, they are not only seeking tactical advantage. They are sending a message. We are organized. We are watching. And we can strike again. That is psychological warfare layered over physical force. Burkina Faso has battled insurgent violence since around 2015. Armed groups linked to wider Sahel networks expanded through rural provinces, exploiting porous borders and weak infrastructure. Tens of thousands have died across the region. The violence itself is not new. But the pattern of these attacks matters more than the numbers. When insurgent movements escalate in coordination, they often do so during moments of transition. They test new leadership. They probe new security structures. They evaluate whether shifts in alliances or doctrine have created temporary vulnerabilities. This looks less like random violence and more like a stress test. Why timing matters. Northern Burkina Faso borders Mali and Niger, 2 countries heavily affected by insurgency. Armed groups operate fluidly across these borders. The terrain favors motorcycles, light vehicles, and decentralized units. It is vast, semi-arid, and difficult to monitor consistently. A coordinated strike across multiple installations suggests intelligence gathering, reconnaissance, and communication capability. Insurgent groups do not escalate blindly. They escalate strategically. Momentum is survival. If they appear weak, recruitment declines. If they appear capable, relevance is maintained. But here is the deeper layer. When attacks focus on military infrastructure instead of purely civilian targets, they challenge something specific. The state's monopoly on force. They attempt to redefine who controls territory and authority. Burkina Faso topping the Global Insurgency Index reflects intensity, not motive. The index measures frequency, impact, and lethality. It does not measure political reform, morale, or long-term restructuring. Quantifies violence. It does not interpret it. And violence in the Sahel has shifted southward over the last decade, making Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso the epicenter of global insurgent activity. Geography amplifies this reality. The battlefield beneath the battlefield. The north is wide and dry. Roads are thin. Communities are isolated. State presence fades quickly outside major towns. Security forces defend fixed bases. Insurgents move fluidly. They strike and disappear. This is not a war of front lines. It is a war of reach. And reach is shaped by more than weapons. It is shaped by economics. When villages empty due to insecurity, markets shrink. Farmers stop planting. Trade routes close. Displacement pressures cities. Food prices rise. Youth unemployment deepens. Insurgency in the Sahel is rarely ideology alone. It is often access to income, belonging, or protection. This is the war beneath the war. Military installations can be rebuilt. Equipment can be replaced. But if economic gaps widen, recruitment regenerates. Climate pressure intensifies the cycle.
Drogt disrupte agriculture.
Pastoral communities compete over shrinking grazing land. fragility multiplies. So when 4 bases are attacked, the visible story is tactical. The structural story is deeper. Burkina Faso faces a dual battlefield: suppress armed groups while rebuilding neglected rural economies. And this is where the moment becomes political. What changed after 2022? Before 2022, Burkina Faso relied heavily on externally supported counterinsurgency models, intelligence sharing, coordinated frameworks, foreign military partnerships. The strategy aimed to stabilize rural zones through centralized structures. Yet violence expanded. By the time Captain Ibrahim Traoré assumed power in September 2022, large parts of the countryside were already contested. The pivot that followed was not cosmetic. First, foreign military relationships were recalibrated. Some external presences were reduced. The message was clear: security architecture would be redefined on national terms. Second, domestic mobilization intensified. Recruitment expanded. Volunteer defense groups were strengthened, emphasizing local familiarity and community integration. Third, rhetoric shifted. Sovereignty became central. The conflict was framed not only as counterinsurgency but as a struggle for national dignity. These changes altered the psychological battlefield immediately, even before they fully altered the military one. And insurgent networks noticed. Structural transitions create recalibration phases. Command chains adjust. Alliances shift. Intelligence pipelines restructure. Such moments can create temporary gaps. Coordinated attacks during transition are classic insurgent behavior. They test response speed. They test morale. And morale is critical. An insurgency survives on the perception that the state is ineffective. If leadership signals renewed determination, armed groups attempt to puncture that perception early. So are these attacks proof of failure, or evidence that transition is being challenged at its most delicate moment? That distinction matters. The generational factor. When Burkina Faso rose to the top of the global insurgency index, many expected fear to dominate public sentiment. Instead, something else emerged, especially among younger Africans: recognition. For Gen Z, instability did not arrive suddenly with these 4 attacks. It has been the background of their adolescence. They watched insurgency expand for years under previous frameworks. They saw external troops rotate in and out. They saw promises of stabilization repeated. So when intensity was finally quantified, it was not shocking. It was confirmation. Older political generations often equate calm rhetoric with competence. Younger generations often equate visible struggle with honesty. They interpret pressure not automatically as collapse, but as confrontation. Under Traoré's leadership, the tone shifted from managed diplomacy to assertive sovereignty. Whether one agrees with every policy is secondary to the reality that posture changed. And posture influences morale. Young Africans question why, after years of externally supported security models, insurgency deepened. They question why rural regions felt peripheral. They question inherited systems. This does not erase suffering. Civilians continue to endure displacement. Markets close. Schools halt. The human cost remains heavy. But many youths distinguish between inherited crisis and chosen direction. They are more willing to endure turbulence if it appears tied to structural change. That psychological shift matters. Insurgencies are not only military contests. They are contests of belief. If morale fractures, armed groups gain leverage. If morale hardens, recruitment becomes harder. But morale alone does not win wars. Reaction or redesign. Burkina Faso stands at a threshold. A reactive state absorbs attacks, reinforces positions, and waits for the next strike. A redesigning state asks harder questions. Why were rural regions so exposed for so long? Why did external heavy frameworks fail to reverse momentum? Why were communities disconnected from their own security architecture? Language of sovereignty must translate into functioning systems. Recruitment drives must become trained units. Volunteer forces must integrate into disciplined command structures. Intelligence must coordinate effectively. The real test is not whether violence exists. Insurgencies persist for years. The test is whether institutional capacity strengthens under pressure instead of fracturing. Gen Z support is not blind loyalty. It is conditional patience. Young Africans are willing to endure turbulence if they see measurable progress. Reopened schools, safer corridors, revived markets. If the transformation produces visible gains, it could reshape regional precedent. If it fails, critics will argue that rupture without stability was reckless. The margin for error is thin. A crucible moment. Burkina Faso is not guaranteed victory, nor is it on the edge of inevitable collapse. It is in a crucible. Heat tests material strength. Some structures melt, others harden. Coordinated attacks are hot. Economic strain is heat. International scrutiny is hot. High insurgency rankings are hot. The defining question of the next decade is whether this heat forges resilience or exposes fractures. For bases were struck in 4 days. At least 10 lives were lost. Installations were damaged. A nation labeled the most insurgency impacted in the world. On the surface, that looks like a siege. But siege alone does not define direction. Direction is defined by response. If escalation accompanies transition, and transition attempts to break a decade-long cycle,